sometimes then what you hear is that, okay, someone will point out, oh, well, this guideline has been produced by a certain sector, so there's a certain sector bias. It's these guys saying this, right? Or it's, if the industry comes up with something, it's the industry that wants to get profit, So, there's again this kind of gap between, for example, the citizens and the ones that want to build the project, right? Because there's this bias. And now for the first time, we have a document and a checklist and whatever that takes the bias out of the conversation. So if a mayor, for example, would use this checklist to talk to the local citizens, for example, about a future project, and they would kind of go through these principles, right, in this checklist to kind of assess whether the developer or the local community or even the local government, if it's initiating its own project, wants to do a project, and somebody says, well, but is there a bias there? They can say, no, there is no bias. Everybody agrees. Dear developer, do you know that your sector association has endorsed this? Dear civil society, are you aware? And dear energy communities, are you aware, right? So you have this kind of common checks and balance system that is in place, and that is novel. You never had that. And locally, when you go to these citizens' assemblies or whatever, right, and you see all these different kind of questions and concerns, so much of this comes down to perceived bias.
What if speed in the energy transition wasn't about removing friction? In this new episode, I speak with Arthur Hinsch of ICLEI, the local government for sustainability, who helped steer one of the most unexpected alignments in European energy, the Fast and Fair Renewables and Grids initiative. With solar and wind projects facing delays of up to 5 years due to local resistance and permitting hurdles, this initiative aims to answer a pressing questions. How do we move faster without cutting corners on democracy or fairness? And the result is a shared blueprint endorsed by industry giants, grassroots cooperatives, environmental NGOs, local authorities, and youth network alike. They agreed on 5 principles to scale up renewables with local people, not despite them. Arthur takes us behind the scenes into the long meetings, the slow consensus building, the in-between spaces where decisions really take shape. Arthur, welcome to the show.
Hello, Marina. Good to be here.
Arthur, your background is quite unique. I learned about it only a few weeks ago when we started preparing. You first studied Japanology and then moved to urban studies and energy policy. What connects these dots for you?
Yeah, that's a question I get asked quite a lot, actually. So it's a fairly logical question. So it's really my background. I've been extremely fascinated by everything Japanese culture since I was a child, basically. So for me, it was always a given that I would enter university and study Japanology or Japanese studies, which I did at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. But also due to kind of my family background and my dad's position as a solar researcher in the energy field, I always had kind of interest in energy topics. And then I, in addition to that, did a baccalaureate, a European baccalaureate at the European School of Bergen in the Netherlands. So I have, these are the 3 worlds basically, and they connected at different moments in my life, I think. So I was always, had an interest in energy policy, energy in general, but also sustainability. So I think even though I started with Japanology or Japanese studies, I had the opportunity to really dive deep into kind of what drives people to engage in sustainability-related actions, not only in Europe, but also in Japan. And it's extremely interesting to see kind of parallels there and differences and all of that from both kind of social perspective and political perspective. So I kind of entered into the sustainable energy interest already in Japanology studies. And then in my master's, I was able to do a master's in international relations, also at the University of Leiden, so international relations / European studies. Yeah, and that's where I dove into kind of this interface between local governments and the European Union. So yeah, I in the end then spent quite some time with kind of researching, what impact does European energy or environmental policy have on local governments and vice versa also. And it's really interesting for me to see, and responding to a question of what connects these worlds is, these facets like culture, policy, and energy, they all play out differently depending on where you are in the world. And I find it so extremely fascinating to look at this from a kind of uniquely Asian perspective as well as a European perspective, right? So now I work for an international network of local governments which has a presence also in Japan and is headquartered in Germany. And I work for the European Secretariat in Freiburg in Germany, kind of being able to bring all of these worlds together in some way or another. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you've been working on overlapping worlds in a sense, like from local governments to institutions to civil society to Europe to Japan and so on. So there must be a fascination you have from this kind of in-between spaces, right? There's probably something that drew you there. There's no coincidence, right?
No, for sure. I mean, I was always very interested in kind of the variety that this offers, right? And that's one of the unique selling points and the big perks of working at ICLEI, I think, is that you're able to kind of connect the worlds of the very practical worlds of, people actually, being responsible and delivering concrete action and being kind of held responsible to the citizens, and connecting that very practical world to the more kind of often high-level policy world of how Europe functions, how European policy is made. And I get a lot of kind of satisfaction of being able to kind of move between these worlds, I think. It's also kind of from a professional point of view quite refreshing, and someday you'll be talking to local mayors and, they have their very specific local challenges and solutions. And the other day you will be talking to the European Commission or the Committee of the Regions or, and having very high level conversations, but then, those conversations having an impact on, again, people on the ground, right? And I think that's so important also going forward. So that's what I find very attractive. And also from a more personal point of view, I mean, I work in Freiburg. For those that don't know, Freiburg im Breisgau is a municipality of around 250,000 people in the south, very south of Germany, close to Basel, close to France and Switzerland, actually. And it's my hometown. So I was born here, and Freiburg, has kind of is internationally known, as this kind of green city, kind of one of the pioneers in the kind of local deployment of solar energy. And when I studied in the Netherlands, even though I'm German, I studied actually my entire studies in the Netherlands, but I always kind of had this connection to my hometown. And then I got into energy policy and I found out, internationally people talk about Freiburg, my hometown, as a kind of city that you should look into when you're interested in this topic. And then a blueprint, exactly. And then I really started to identifying with this concept, and that's why I ended up doing what I'm doing, I think.
I think in a way we don't realize how much our upbringing shape our experience and then our understanding of the world as well. Because I mean, now you work in between, let's say, different stakeholders, which is also something that I do, and you work between cultures and countries. It's really fascinating sometimes to make a step back and say, yeah, indeed, there is no coincidence, and some of us, I would say, were like managing to connect some dots at different levels. We probably don't see them when they happen, but then we're like, yeah, of course it happens. I mean, the experience you just shared with like being able to discuss with different levels. I remember having it a long time ago when I was in Brussels with the Energy Ombudsman. I was handling complaints in the morning, and then in the afternoon I was at the European Commission, and they were completely different jobs, but they were indispensable, right? Because it's really in this kind of in working through these frictions that you actually get some best result. And that leads us to the Fast and Fair Renewables and Grids initiative, which was months in the making. And I mean, I've heard about it. I know it sounds really groundbreaking and really interesting. There's an event, I think, at the end of September 2025 in Brussels. But I'm really interested in understanding if there was any kind of spark to start with, or some gaps that you had been identifying, and what they were. I mean, was it coming from this kind of, let's say, very empirical and observation that there was gaps?
Well, yes, to answer the question shortly, I mean, this is exactly it. There is gaps. I mean, gaps in the sense, or there's challenges in the sense that, projects are accelerating. We see more projects around Europe, which is nice, but we don't see them still at the speed that is required. And often, I mean, not only, there's different reasons why projects kind of get delayed, and it's, different reasons, lack of staff and permitting authorities, lack of digitalization, what have you, But A significant factor is actually the kind of local acceptance and the local engagement of local citizens with renewable energy and grid infrastructure, electricity grid infrastructure. And what you see in practice is that, of course, the majority of Europeans, tends to be in favor of more renewables and more wind, more solar. But actually, when it comes down to local projects, the situation is not always as easy and quite regularly, The majority of local people might be in favor of the project locally, but then some will not, and they have their own reasons. They might be very vocal about it for their own reasons. Yeah. So there certainly is a gap, right? I mean, the gap is simply that at the local level, different stakeholders, I suppose, be this citizens or local environmental groups or local cooperatives or local developers or local investors, they often don't agree. Yeah. So this is it. Or they don't agree, or they have different, let's say, intrinsic motivations sometimes or often what they want to get out of the project. And this is not due to any form of kind of malice or anything. This is simply because how the energy system works, right? If you're the developer, you want to get a profit out of your project, if you want, because you need to maintain a profit margin, right? If in a business, and if you're the investor, you want to get a return on your investment. And if you're the landowner, who might be from the community, but also might be third generation, no longer living in the community, you want a land lease payment. If you're the environmental group, you want to protect nature. If you're the energy cooperative, you might want to have direct participation, local ownership of the new renewable energy installation. Citizens have their own reasons, might potentially concern. Some of them are also very enthusiastic about it. And then you have the local government, and the majority of, let's say, large-scale, renewable energy installations are deployed in rural areas. Same goes for grids, I suppose, transmission grids. And what you then see is often that the local government has an interest in the project because they want to meet their own energy climate targets. They want to have some value from the project locally. But often the mayor then, or other local government staff or persons are in the position that they have to mediate between these interests. Simply, that's often the fact of the matter. That's how the dynamics often play out in rural communities. And that is not an easy thing to do. Like, if you imagine, like, you're a rural mayor in a small municipality in some one particular member state. We looked into a couple, actually. The situation is often that, you're a voluntary mayor and you have a ton of things on your portfolio that you need to take care of. And then the deployment of an additional wind park is an additional thing. And you often neither have the staff, nor the technical capacity, nor the finances to kind of really look into this, right? Or actually mediate. But what you then often see is projects that are actually accepted and where the local enthusiasm that is often correlated happens at the same time as there being a lot of trust in the local mayor, for example, right? So there you really see this important position of the local mayor or the local government in kind of mediating between different interests at the local level so that the project does not escalate. Everything comes together harmoniously. And you really have examples of that. And that results in the projects not being delayed because they don't end up in court. And the court doesn't have to step in and rule what is fair. Instead, fairness is agreed beforehand between all the parties. So that's the fundamental problem. And we then thought, because we've been working as ICLEI in this field for a long time, together with the other stakeholders that have endorsed the initiative. But we initially, from our side, we thought, okay, we represent local governments. We see that there is an issue. This is one of the key issues. One of the key issues is, as I said, local conflicts and differences in opinions. So how about we get all these stakeholders together at a higher level, and we agree at a high level once and for all, what does it actually mean to deploy a project fast but fairly? And then with the idea of trickling that down to the local levels, and how we do that in practice is something we can talk about, of course, later in this conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesting because a few episodes ago, I had Sidaran of Europe talking exactly about what really just transition means. And a few episodes ago, I also had a researcher, Junior Mbangala, who works exactly on this kind of RESoom understanding. So almost a philosophical understanding that we are not alone when we take a decision. We are all connected at different levels. And the way we make our decisions, we take our decisions, is actually shaped by the surroundings that we have. And right now, you just underlined that, for instance, mayors may be under a lot of strains. There may not be enough capacity at their local level. Maybe they don't understand. Maybe they don't see why something happens in their municipality and not in the other one. So they hear things like windmills are ugly or things like that, and they get also influenced by that. And of course, they want to please their constituents. So they have this very important role as mediator, but first and foremost, they need to be convinced of the importance of, let's say, the project to happen. And for that, they also need their viewpoint to be heard, right? Because disagreeing is actually very important to find a consensus at the end of the day, right? You need to be expressed your frustration first. Otherwise, it breaks down at a later stage, perhaps.
Yes. Well, I mean, in the end, I mean, what I've seen locally is that it comes down to very kind of human reasons ultimately, right?
Yeah.
Because the people want a project, and in an ideal scenario, they all kind of get along, and they all collectively see a value, right? So, and the question is, of course, how do you deliver added value of a particular project to a local community in a way that is kind of satisfactory to the local community, but also in a way that is then, of course, complying with national regulations and all of that. So that's a bit of this interface between this high dynamic situation between humans, right, and with different ideas and maybe also emotions, and on the other hand, the question of how does all of that fit within the realities of spatial planning procedures and permitting regulations and all of that. And that's where it becomes tricky. And that's exactly the interface that I think this Fast and Fair Renewables and Grids initiative that we now have launched actually is trying to come in, right, and kind of bridge that gap. And yeah, indeed, I am aware that you talked to SEDA at Can Europe, actually, so we talking quite regularly within the context of the initiative, and the initial idea was also certainly to have kind of a close, collaborations between local government and civil society within the context of all of this. And so indeed, I'm quite happy that Can Europe, of course, is one of the organizations that represents kind of civil society and organizations battling dangerous climate change in the Fast and Fair initiative, which is quite important.
You've been saying that, the Fast and Fair initiative is a very social, very human project. What do you mean by that? I really think that a lot of parties, stakeholders, whatever that means, are kind of afraid of, the challenges that it represents to build this consensus. But you said it's very social, it's very human. So how did that happen?
Yeah.
How did you move forward?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in very practical terms, I mean, it's a social project because it's an initiative that tries to solve a social problem, which is local conflicts due to the accelerated deployment of renewables and grids, with a social approach by getting different organizations who are, of course, represented by different people to agree on a baseline, on a consensus, and that is simply a social approach, right? So in the end, in very practical terms, so how did this play out? Originally, when we had this idea, we started reaching out to the organizations that have now actually endorsed the principles with just suggestions to just have a chat. Yeah, let's just talk about it. Yeah, and the advantage, of course, is they knew us. I mean, they knew ICLEI Europe, right? Many of the organizations, they are regularly in touch already. It's not like the endorsing stakeholders are not talking at all to each other. That would be very far from the truth. The fact is just they have not yet agreed on a cross-sectoral baseline on fairness. Yeah, so that's the novelty here. But yeah, in reality, we just invited all the stakeholders to chats to explain the idea. And I think the crucial part here was to really explain that, we're doing this for the common good. We're doing it to have a win-win situation for everyone, right? So, and this is important to understand, I think all the stakeholders come into this with the kind of expectation that they're kind of contributing to the formation of these principles and this initiative in the long run. But at the same time, everybody gets something out of it, right? Because, from the developer's point of view, the win-win situation. The win situation is that, if these principles are adhered to, not only by the developers, obviously, but also the other stakeholders in the sectors are equally responsible in upholding these principles. If everybody sticks to these principles, then projects don't ever end up in court, for at least not for the reason of acceptance problems. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a huge win from the industry side, and then of course from for example, environmental organizations. Yeah, there's emphasis on upholding building the mitigation hierarchy, for example, and kind of the deployment of measures to compensate the impact of infrastructure, for example, from a nature point of view. That is in the text, right? And of course, from the environmental organizations, I mean, that's a big win for them, right? So, and that's equally for the energy cooperatives and energy communities in the mix, right? And we have a clear principle that now it says everybody, regardless of whether you're a big, small developer, corporate, or nonprofit, all agree on the importance of renewable energy communities and citizen-led and co-owned installations. That's the novelty here. And that's arriving at that point is very social because everybody needs to be actually conscious and aware, or needs to feel from the very beginning that this has chance of succeeding, but really from the perspective of, there's really a benefit for us to do this because this is not a European project in the sense that, we're not a consortium of 10 partners that are paid for this. It's, that's not the case. So it's just everybody's in this because it makes sense for everyone. Man.
Well, there's a moment when you felt that there was very different interest at stake and maybe, just putting people around the table wouldn't work out that successfully.
Yes. I mean, in the sense that that's, I think, a normal process of trying to build consensus in a heated topic. Yeah. I mean, when you're trying to set out and say, okay, let's jointly identify across the sector what fairness means, and initial reactions were, okay, cool, but isn't that ambitious? It's like, yeah, sure, it's ambitious, but if we don't do it, if we don't try it, and never achieve. So yeah, there's certainly been this kind of moments. I think I won't be able to go into exact, the content of who and what. I think that was kind of between the different stakeholders during the consensus building process. It's not necessarily something that needs to go live. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the principles, right, I think the readers and listeners will be able to discern relatively quickly which of these principles might have been the most tricky ones to kind of get, for-profit industry and non-profit industry and energy communities to agree on, right? So this is...
Yeah, so let's get into it. Let's go into these principles. Let's go from tricky to less tricky, right? Or as you wish.
Yeah, fine.
Which, let's go for what is the trickiest? What was the trickiest for you in meeting?
So I think when you look at kind of existing guidelines and activities that happen around Europe around the, kind of creating community value or acceptance of renewable energy infrastructure and equally electricity grids, and you see that there's common reference to certain themes, right? So the importance of having local projects, communities need to have local influence. You have a local project, but you also need to have local value, right? So this is not new stuff. You see this quite often, right? You also see quite a lot of reference in terms of, the environmental element that needs to be really taken into account thoroughly. So that's not so novel. And the last principle, which is on kind of empowering community-led initiatives, I think this is where was not, let's say, the easiest to get everybody on the same page, I suppose, in terms of how, this, but also other principles could be phrased. Yeah. But again, I think this is a fairly technical conversation. But again, I think it's quite clear when you just look at the sub-criteria, what the difficulty might have been there. But to maybe answer it like this, the situation in Europe up until now was that we had in the Renewable Energy Directive, for example, certain articles pertaining to the importance of presumerism, renewable energy communities, and collective self-consumption. Yeah. These articles had to be transposed into European legislation already for quite a few years. And even now, the speed and the degree to which that has happened differs significantly between the countries, right? And there's also significant differences in terms of how different member states have kind of implemented an enabling framework, for example, for renewable energy communities and citizen energy communities, respectively, right?
Yeah. So, in Italy, for instance, it's very, very different from what you see in Belgium. Exactly. And I mean, it's very technical, very business-oriented, it's not that bottom-up. And actually, in Italy, they had to invent the social energy community to bring back the social into the mix, whereas in the directive, I mean, at first glance, it seemed quite obvious that it should have been included. But, it's the devil really lies in the detail for implementation.
Exactly. That's it. And I think what you also have seen in the past a lot, and still do to some extent, is of course that the element of renewable energy communities being included in the legislation and the need to create proper enabling frameworks for them used to be primarily promoted by civil society. Yeah, not only, but generally speaking. And that's no longer the case. So now we have actually a agreement across sectoral that, there needs to be an enabling framework and a level playing field for energy communities and actors with less financial and administrative capacity on the energy market. And the fact, I think, that we now have an agreement on this point between the energy community sector, the civil society, and the, large solar and wind industry associations is saying a lot. And I think that very fact in the future will help a lot when it comes to, continuing to pushing further enabling frameworks for renewable energy communities for starters, but also simply just to encourage or to ask for really more projects to have some kind of component of local direct financial or even ownership participation. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we now have, this kind of consensus between the sectors is really quite something. And this, but also other points, I suppose. Of course, that's why this process took six months, because different sectors, stakeholders go at a document and an exercise like this with different motivations. Some things could be in the document even more emphasized so this is the fine nuance, I suppose, right? And I won't go into who said what specifically, because that's among the endorsing stakeholders. But it's quite clear when you read the document. It's not an easy subject in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's really important just to not to start from a too naive place, to know that different stakeholders will have different motivation and different objectives. And maybe some will endorse without second thoughts, whereas some other will have to work also kind of internally within their organization to make sure that, they become the blueprint that it's meant to be. And I see that, it's very straightforward probably for let's say NGOs, organizations with more social purpose, etc. But it's probably there's still some passage that may be still in their discussion for certain organizations as well, because it's such a high level that, and again, because the devil lies in the detail, that, it's not that easy. But I guess it's what makes it concrete. But what else could make really that initiative so concrete and so grounded that we will see the results in the years?
Yes, exactly. So maybe just one remark still on the details. For devil lies in the details. I think that's where the initiative and the principles get a lot of credibility from. It's not like, a group of organizations just came, together for a half an hour meeting and then brought up these principles. It's actually that we had these meetings, that we had a longer workshop in Brussels where we tried to consolidate that. And then there were many conversations after. So actually we had a launch event, and until, just a couple of days or even one day before the launch event, it was not clear whether everybody will endorse. So it was really kind of a game. Wow. Yeah. So it's really a bit of a game in that sense, ultimately, with a very positive outcome, but that's how these things go. Then in terms of what makes it then concrete is the fact that it took quite a long time to negotiate this. So basically every word that's in this document has been scrutinized in that sense, has been evaluated by the different organizations and their respective members. Or at least the organizations have consulted their membership, right? So that's why you can trust that this process has gone through a legitimate phase, and this consultation phase and this discussion phase. So just to kind of remark that. And then when it comes to the concrete kind of application of this, now this is of course where it becomes interesting, because that's basically what the future is all about, right? So we now need to ensure that these principles actually get used and applied locally in concrete projects. So there's a couple of things that we have planned. So first, now with the launch event of the principles, and this launch event also being the moment where I thought, okay, well, now this has indeed tons of potential, because all the stakeholders came together and they said why they thought this initiative was important. They gave good best practices from their context. And then we founded the initiative. It's now its own kind of presence online. So fastfairenergy.eu. and with the ambition really to create kind of the ultimate European go-to hub for fairness around energy. Yeah. So this is really where you would go when you want to know, okay, what are best practices that are kind of supported by the different sectors, that they can agree behind. To what extent does knowledge exist that kind of really supports the argument that you need more measures locally to drive fairness or acceptance? To what extent does that knowledge connect those measures to indeed an acceleration of renewables? I think that's something that we need more and more research into, and I would I'm really looking forward to more and more of this kind of research materializing. I'm aware that a couple of institutes are looking into this, but this is something we need more of, right? So this will be kind of hosted on the initiative. That's the idea. But then more importantly, or not more importantly, but certainly also very importantly, we want to engage further with local governments and with the members of the different European organizations, right? So what we've been doing in the past couple of months as ICLEI, in partnership with a couple of other organizations, we have talked to many rural local governments, mostly in a few countries. So in Germany, Spain, France, Italy, and Poland. And we really asked them kind of, what is your perception, your subjective perception of fairness in your project, right? And we got hugely different responses, right? But they all kind of, showed a general trend. And the general trend is that there seems to be quite some evidence, actually, of positive impact of renewable and also electricity grid infrastructure locally in terms of value. The bottom line often is that, unfortunately, these kind of approaches are not deployed across the board. They're not the norm yet, and that is really an issue. From the local government's perspective, it's an issue, but also from everybody else's issue, I would say, perspective, that's an issue, because projects end up in court often, right? So we have carried out these conversations. We have this long document with all these statements from mayors, because we wanted actually, the local governments to have a voice in all of this. I think we on the European discourse level, kind of there's too few direct statements from local governments in this debate, and that's something we wanted to contribute with this paper. I think this is quite important. And then we have not only interviewed and talked to mayors, that would have been nice by itself, but we also have delivered workshops for them. So we've actually engaged in these 5 countries. We took these principles and we basically converted them into a checklist. It's hosted on the website of the initiative, and basically what it does, it showcases the 5 baseline principles of the Fast and Fair Renewables and Grids initiative, and showcases them as not only a checklist that you can go to, basically, but when you deploy a new project, but as a kind of mediation tool. So it takes these principles, these high-level principles, which tend to be phrased, quite generally, because they need to be applicable across all the different member states, and it takes them and it kind of slims them down to a couple of questions. And so as the municipality, or also as anyone else, you can take a look at this checklist and you basically use it to determine first whether your project kind of meets this cross-sectoral standard or this agreement in terms of what fairness is. Now, why is this important? I mean, you could just say, oh, well, it's just another kind of guideline, right? Fair enough. But the difference here is that this checklist is really rooted in a cross-sectoral consensus, which means that it's incredibly credible. The nice thing about this, and this used to happen sometimes in the past, is some organization develops their guideline, and there's tons of really good guidelines out there how you develop community benefits and acceptance and enthusiasm. They're all have a lot of value, and I would really encourage people to take a look at those. But sometimes then what you hear is that, okay, someone will point out, oh, well, this guideline has been produced by a certain sector, so there's a certain sector bias. Oh, it's these guys saying this, right? Or it's, if the industry comes up with something, it's the industry that he wants to get covered,
Yeah.
So there's again this kind of gap between, for example, the citizens and the ones that want to build the project, right? Because there's this bias. And now for the first time, we have a document and a checklist and whatever that takes the bias out of the conversation. So if a mayor, for example, would use this checklist to talk to the local citizens, for example, about a future project, and they would kind of go through these principles, right, in this checklist to kind of assess whether the developer or the local community or even the local government, if it's initiating its own project, wants to do a project, and somebody says, well, but is there a bias there? They can say, no, there is no bias. Everybody agrees. Dear developer, do you know that your sector association has endorsed this? Dear civil society, are you aware? And dear energy communities, are you aware? Right? So you have this kind of common checks and balance system that is in place, and that is novel. You never had that. And locally, when you go to these citizens' assemblies or whatever, right, and you see all these different kind of questions and concerns, so much of this comes down to perceived bias. And the idea is if you take this out of the conversation and you agree across the sectors, then you have a completely different departure point for your conversations. And the hope is that in the future, there will be more harmonious kind of conversations going forward. Yeah, so that's a long way to kind of answer your question about the concreteness, I suppose. So we're having more of these kind of workshops where we explain this to people. We're having a general exercise, but also where we're trying to take the European principles and adapt them into the framing of the, let's say, spatial planning and permitting relations in several member states. We're going to start primarily with Germany and Spain now in the coming year, because that's from a more practical point of view, because as a mayor or as a developer operating in a certain energy market context or regulatory context, you'll be working within that context, which means that you, of course, can refer to high-level statements, but it's easier to refer to those high-level statements if they're phrased in a way that is easily connectable to the realities of, let's say, your spatial planning or permitting framework, right? So this kind of adaptation exercise we're doing, we're inviting, again, then kind of national organizations to contribute to that. So the kind of mirror organizations, the European endorsing stakeholders. And then we're doing tons of communications work, interviews, and it's nice to see this popping up in the media sometimes. Not yet as much as I would like, but it's coming there. So it's nice, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you're about to take a 6-month break in Asia, including Japan, where part of your academic journey began. So perhaps we'll export the Fast and Fair initiative back to Japan, or maybe learn a few things about connecting cultures and building bridges, right? Because it's been all about that. And I found what you said about this kind of perception of bias and perception of fairness incredibly powerful. And I guess that it's really by having a very open mind who has traveled that you manage to see through these things. So would you dream to export it to Japan? Or at least this way of doing it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do have my connections, my professional connections in Japan as well, kind of in the energy space. Actually, back in the day when I did my bachelor, I used to intern at an organization called ISAP, the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies, which is, by the way, they're to blame for kind of me now working on, community acceptance and all of that, because I've been doing work related to kind of collective energy action in Japan when I was at their place. And that's kind of
you didn't mention that.
No, I could have, but we already jumped to the next question. But yes, that's indeed one of the reasons, indeed. So if anyone listens to this, the conversation in its entirety, they will find it out. But and I'm sure they will, I hope. But in any case, it would be interesting to do that, right? So, I mean, the Fast and Fair Renewables and Grids consensus is an exercise that is in its core replicable. Yeah. So having said that, within Europe, there was no need to do this exercise again. We already have an adaptation. So even if you now go to the national countries, we're not reopening any principles. We're just asking the questions, how do you rephrase them within the context of these existing regular relations that they even easier usable in practical terms. Yeah. You can even use them without, but would make it even easier. Now, if you go into other regions of the world, we are, of course, also keeping in mind that we're selling this as a European kind of consensus, right? Cross-sectoral consensus. Indeed, the question would arise, to what extent you would need to kind of readapt or redo this consensus building exercise a little bit to, conform to the realities of the US market or the, South African market or the Japanese market or the ASEAN market for that sense, right? And the reason for this is because I think perceptions of renewables in terms of to what extent they are accepted locally and or how these dynamics play out locally, how people kind of voice their either enthusiasm or not enthusiasm, kind of the disagreement. You see that kind of differ a lot between different countries in the world. It's also depending on general kind of democracy dynamics and the kind of social dynamics, I think. And this will certainly influence how the exact principles will be phrased. There are certain terms in the kind of technical terms that I think might not be so in reader in the US or in Canada, for example, certain terms might, without further explanation, not be entirely clear what we mean with them. And this is quite important to have this kind of sure. So that's kind of the question mark there. For now, we're focusing on Europe, but certainly, to my knowledge, this exercise is also the first one globally that has actually done that. I don't think there's been a cross-sectoral agreement on fairness in other places in the world, at least if there is, I'd be happy to learn about it and connect, but I don't think that's the case yet. So that's the technical part in terms of would I be interested in exporting it? Maybe. Now we're focusing on the implementation in European fronts. I mean, ICLEI, of course, is a global network and all of that, but at the moment, ICLEI Europe and the endorsing stakeholders currently are focusing on European context. And then potentially there's room for the kind of global export. And then to answer your question on the next 6 months, so indeed, so I'll be going on a sabbatical and I will be not working on this. So I will be doing anything else than working on this, and I need a bit of a distance. I think it was an intense year, I think, for me certainly, and also the colleagues kind of working with me on this initiative and this project. Is, it certainly has been like multiple months of having kind of told everyone this is what we want to do and this is what needs to happen, and everything has kind of been going to high levels and everything, but there was, until one day before the launch event, there was never a guarantee that this will actually happen. So it was basically 1 year of hoping and pushing for it, right? And that's just how it goes. That's just how it goes. But that plus kind of me, we're now working on the topic of kind of collective energy and acceptance for, I think, the last 8-9 years. I think I need a bit of a break, go back to Japanese culture. That's what I'm going to do most of the time. Look at it from that perspective and come back refreshed and kind of re-enter all of this, and which of course I look forward to do. And in the meantime, the initiative does not sleep, not so at all. There's tons of activities planned. Some of them I've alluded to, and my colleague Silvia Salini is the coordinator of the initiative in my absence. But yeah, I'm looking forward to a bit of a breather. Yeah.
It's great. One very, very last question. Is there any kind of lesson you would like to learn from this trust building exercise? I mean, it's not, I've had people who talk about the initiative, but not so many people who talk about how you build it. So I find it incredibly valuable, really the how-to. And yeah, for me, it's from the conversation we've been having, really this part around the various definitions of the fact that, people are kind of afraid of the bias, or really believing that the other party has an ulterior motive and being some kind of break for further action, because you feel that there's no level play field, or there might be full play somewhere and so on. I find it incredibly interesting in what you just said. And the listeners know that I'm really fascinated about the topic of trust, how you build it, how you make it happen in concrete terms. But yeah, beyond really the project results, what is the lesson you would like to take with you on your luggage to Japan?
Yeah, so just maybe in terms of my lesson, and then maybe the kind of lesson in generally for others who might replicate something like this in other fields. So in terms of my lesson, so I really enjoyed bringing people together behind something that I truly believe makes a difference for the sake of the common good. I mean, that's key. That's we talk about sustainability. That is really key. It's about different sectors coming together for a certain given purpose, and especially for renewables, right? I mean, it's really about this all hands on deck approach. We need more renewables, and renewables are the thing to do. We need to achieve climate neutrality. So let's all agree on how to do this in a fair way. So that's I think what has been achieved without creating additional legislation. That's also just something to mention. This is not a legislative initiative. This is a sectoral-led initiative because people came together because they thought it was a good idea. So, and that links me, and so that's something I want to do more in the future. I think it's something I took a lot of satisfaction out. Of course, it was challenging, but I took a lot of satisfaction when it actually materialized, and now also being able to talk about it and seeing how these principles hopefully will be further taken up locally. And which in itself will take a lot of work, I'm sure, in the future. But that's something I would like to do more, certainly, yeah. And in terms of for someone else, so based on my experience, there's a couple of things I'm supposed to understand, but the bottom line is that I think giving everyone the idea that we're in this for a win-win situation from the very start is very important. So the first email you send to any organization or person that you want to have be part of this, make sure that this is bulletproof in the sense that there is no, it's already clear that this is not, you're not doing this to further the gain of your own organization primarily, or you're not trying to push a certain narrative on stakeholders. I think that's quite important.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it has helped for this particular project that ICLEI Europe has been active in this field for a long time. We have been working a lot with, civil society, with the energy communities, with the industrial players as well, different occasions. But we have our foot in all these kind of worlds a little bit, right? And we are also perceived as a little bit the party in the middle sometimes, or quite regularly. And I think that has helped us as ICLEI Europe and also me as kind of Arthur Hinsch, that kind of has initiated and facilitated this, to move this across the finish line. Yeah. So I think that is a very unique kind of context that needs to be maybe understood here. Yeah. And of course, what also helps is, you need to be able to facilitate processes. Yeah. So you need to, it's a thing, if you have a workshop, and then you have to be able to have someone that is able to manage and moderate a workshop like that. So it comes with a lot of knowledge. Yeah. So I feel, it feels a bit weird to kind of talk about myself in this way, but I think the fact that I have been working at ICLEI now for about 7 years, and in this field for like 8 or 9. And I think, there's a lot of knowledge that comes with it in terms of energy policy, the nuances in terms of, which organization is in favor of which, and, anticipating which organization is going to make a stronger push for a certain topic, and then anticipating how the other organization might respond to it. And then before it comes to the discussion, anticipating already the outcome of that discussion. That is something that was quite important actually here with this particular exercise. And I can imagine if you take this similar kind of approach to other fields, it might be similar. Yeah. And of course, when you look at how European policy or anything is made, that's just how it works. And that's how consensus is a common. That's how consensus is achieved. But I think in terms of the replicability, it can be done in any kind of scenario where there is a issue that can be solved at a higher level by bringing people together. And of course, I'm really hyper focused on renewables, so I don't have the overview of all the other kind of fields. I mean, we as ICLEI, we are quite large. We're like 200 people, like working on like NBS and energy-based solutions and all these like, other sustainability related topics. But so I can't tell you exactly the details of other topical fields and the replicability, but I can imagine that you would have similar scenarios where, there's simply because of the nature of certain frameworks or markets or whatever, that there would be differences in opinion. And often there's a cause for these differences, and they're not because people don't agree because they don't like to agree. It's because they come from different perspectives, intrinsically based on what organization or sector they represent. And then this can often be mediated at a higher level, and that requires that as a facilitator you're actually able to do this based on your knowledge that you've acquired over a long time. So I think that's quite important to approach from that perspective as well.
Yeah, okay. Arthur, thank you for this really incredibly passionate conversation about really like trust building and fairness. And I've learned a lot, and I will definitely follow super closely the fast and fair renewable initiatives. And there are so many lessons to learn. So I hope our listeners and viewers will find it as interesting as I do. So when can we start contacting you again, Arthur?
Well, I am still working until the end of August, and then I will be gone for 6 months, and I'll be back on the 1st of March. So if people want to contact me, then they can do that 1st of March. But having said that, the initiative is very much contactable, and that's my colleague Sylvia. So there's actually the website. It's I think info@fastenfairenergy.eu or something. There is contact details, of course, for the initiative as a whole, and the initiative carries forward even when I'm not there, because I'm quite happy that it does, because that would be rather horrific if it's just depending on me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Enjoy your well-deserved break, and please come back with many more ideas and a lot of energy, of course. And all the best for the future. Thank you so much, Arthur.